The month wore on and the September nights were getting longer and days shorter. Soon it would be October, a time for celebration in the wizard world. Cecilia looked out of her window at the sky, filled with cloud, low level and, as they skittered along below her, every so often dispersing and reforming so the waves below crashing against Durmstrang's castle tower foundations could be glimpsed. It was so much colder here. Cecilia, who had never been one for cold weather, had taken to her winter clothing and would not be seen without a thick jumper and at least 2 pairs of socks. It didn't help that the windows to the institute were barred with wooden shutters and she had moved her bed to the corner of the room, as far away from it as possible. She looked down. Perhaps she should make an effort to lose herself in some sort of research here again. With nothing to occupy her mind, Cecilia was convinced she could feel the inhospitable conditions here more acutely. Before, she had given her mind over to a cure for lycanthropy, even though it existed here, because her mind could not leave behind the potion she had been developing for Remus in the other world, the one that she had come through from all those years ago, nor could she ignore the other potion, the one for Harry, even though they were completely irrelevant and redundant here. The third, for which she had officially been at Durmstrang, commonality between wizards and non-wizards she had long ago vowed she would never touch again. She looked into the newly ashen fire, the fuel having burned out a few hours ago, and sighed. It would be a good few hours more before an elf came to refill it. How could someone survive here? How had she, for nearly 2 years? But she had. So different the institute was compared to Hedgewood's that it was, Durmstrang had its own flavor. Torches illuminated the corridors and classrooms, students wore suitably insulating clothing made of a variety of animal products, heavy velvets and dense cottons, dressed identically with no differentiation for house, for there was no such system here. They were focused in their work. They had to be. A parent who would send their child to Durmstrang would have to see them pass rigorous academic tests designed to stretch their capabilities to the limit. Failure was not an option either. All students worked feverishly, completing work independently, fighting for space in the cramped library as early as 5 in the morning, choosing their lessons carefully around the availability of their staff. And if the students were dedicated, it was nothing compared with the teachers. Many were not seen from one week to the next, working feverishly on their current research and often having to be reminded that they needed to teach lessons and getting put out at having to leave their work. One teacher Cecilia hadn't seen for the first 15 months of her being there and only saw him because he was being carried out of his classroom on a stretcher by 2 elves, apparently having fainted from malnutrition and dehydration. It was no wonder she was sent there by Cleus, she fitted in perfectly. Cecilia made her way over to her bed and, fully clothed, got in. This time it was different. Now she was here and she was going to spy, as she had been instructed to before, on the research of the teachers there. She would put her mind to a measure of espionage. It was something she had to do if it were to keep her mind off Septimus and Remus. For arguing about her lot was, of course, futile. This time it was different. She was in control. And that she and Ragnhild were able to talk, both professionally and a little personally, was what she needed now that she wasn't deliberately cutting herself off from everyone and everything out of spite. She had a liking for Professor Anderson professionally, she was talented and dedicated, and she cared deeply for her daughter's well-being and happiness. Unpopularly, she had held out for Crystal Lear to attend Hedgewood's and worked on 2 research areas in order for her and her non-wizard husband to afford the school fees and to live for. As a non-wizard, he was virtually unemployable in the wizard world and spent his time fishing for a living around Iceland's coast. For everything that Durmstrang stood for represented fundamentalism of magic, the boiling down of magical talent to its basics, and Felixson, the wizard from whom she had borrowed the art of the wise from and made a pair of copies, was turning out to be the figurehead that had brought it all together. Magic was dominant, and reason and scientific rigor applied. Though she didn't know what entirely Cleus wanted her to spy for, or on whom, she guessed that keeping an eye on Felix's son wouldn't be far from the mark, and she had written some preliminary information down and sent it via a secure owl that her brother-in-law had organized for the purpose to him. Cecilia had even taught 2 lessons on her supposed subject area of magically relevant science. The students, unlike those from Hedgewood's and Hogwarts before, sat in silence bar the scratching of quill on parchment, wrapped in her discourse on basic genetics before scuttling off, questionless, to complete an assignment she had set. This at least tied in with Ragnhild's line of research, namely the prevalence of redheads in magical communities and whether redheads of all cultures were predisposed to magic. Ragnhild, in turn, was delighted to be working with someone who had previously worked for Severus Snape. Cecilia had not corrected her, though the words "with Severus Snape" were ready at hand whenever the woman mentioned it, which she did frequently. It had been another conversation with the truth-teller ere which that Cecilia had guessed at another reason that Cleus had returned her so readily. The conjurist and conjurist sympathizers put a lot of store in the dates of 30th October, 30th April, when, supposedly, time was at its thinnest. Ragnhild had explained that Halloween was a day to not be scared, when wizards dressed up because of the next days, 31st October and 1st May, to frighten all of the monsters back into the dimensions. Conjurists believed old magic worked best on 30th October, and it had been supported by Felix's empirical evidence where he had measured the energy levels of tens of thousands of spells a month before and a month after both 30th October and 30th April, confirming that those cast on these dates were easiest to perform and most likely to be successful. And she already felt her role as spy was coming to an end. Felix's had published The Art of the Wize for the European market and written in English. How close it was to the original manuscripts from which she had made 2 meticulous copies Cecilia was not certain, but she did feel that the effort she had gone to procuring the information for Cleus had been somewhat wasted. In addition, it was a core text for old Durmstrang students, and she remembered in the early days children wandering about the school, books tucked under arms, one of which being Felix's. How long would it be until Hedgewood's students had copies of the same? The Daily Prophet, one outside publication that was available here via owl delivery, copy of which she had picked up having been left behind by a student, spoke about the education system in Britain being worryingly compromised in their admission of non-wizards, accusing the government of twisting the facts about the benefits of inclusion, about how the accommodation of such students would affect the education of all of the students at Hedgewood's and the problems the wizards and non-wizards would face, for they would not mixing. Cecilia had rolled her eyes. Traditional non-wizard schools had never had a problem accommodating wizards who chose to attend those schools, and all primary schools took a mixture of both. It wasn't as if children from both heritages had never met one another before. Cecilia looked at the fire, which was dim and dull and into which she had tossed the prophet once she had read it. The grate had crackled as it consumed its fuel and, for a moment, Cecilia had wondered who was trying to contact her. She blinked, and turned away when the flames betrayed the copper salt which must have been used to treat the newspaper, for the greenish tinge must have come from the prophet as there was no Flu network connection at Durmstrang. Neither indeed were pensieves permitted. The idea of such was looked down upon by the teachers as well as the students as being a waste of time and a compromise to their time which could otherwise be spent working and improving their grades. Such was the fear of failure. Cecilia could understand Ragnhild's point of view. The pressure was almost oppressive, cruel even, so much so that she didn't want her own daughter here. The place was full of contradictions. The staff embarked on work which was at the cutting edge of research as diverse as wand lore and the use of magic in theatre whilst still maintaining an exclusive and oppressive wizard ethos. No modern magical technology was permitted, and yet the students were expected to be able to flew in the outside world and, more recently, use portable pensieves. The school ran as a sort of collective where the progress and outcomes were determined, In all the time she had been there she had never seen the headmaster, let alone knew who he was. The research was transient too. Ragnhild often bemoaned the fact that ultimately her work was pointless and in vain because, apart from her findings being published internally for use by staff for further research, it would be read by precisely no one outside the tall walls of Durmstrang. Even the research staff, ranging from a wizard with clearly elf heritage, Ragnhild herself, a truth-teller, and as such mistrusted and shunned in the wizard world, and the rumor that the member of staff in charge of plants and herbology had traits akin to the carnivorous plants that he studied, all these were overlooked in the name of pure academic pursuit. Even her own thinly veiled background as a non-wizard had probably been guessed at, and yet, as long as she produced research that could be used by others in the future, no one cared. Yet the privacy and exclusivity of what went on here was fiercely defended, even by Professor Anderson. Under no circumstances would they, as a school, endorse international academic cooperation. Should anyone discovered that Cecilia had disclosed the information that she had to Ticklius, and Severus too, it would be more of a disgrace than the whole school discovering she was a non-wizard. So many incongruities. And yet, with a Durmstrang education, the students here who emerged aged 17 blinking into the warm sunlight, they had a pick of careers with companies and the government queuing up to offer them a position. Cecilia got to her feet. Perhaps now would be a good time to make herself available to the students. There was never a fear she wouldn't have some in her classroom, for someone would need to understand the basics of genetics. But really her desire to teach was more to escape the fear that was looming over there, out of reach in her mind but hanging there, like a storm cloud. Teaching would put her feelings about her situation and her betrayal by Cleus out of her immediate thoughts. As she opened the door to her room, Cecilia was met by the chill that was ever present in the corridor, its narrow girth bordered on the outside by large windows open fully to the seascape around them and whatever the current weather happened to be. Even though it was sunny outside, the wind whipped along, chilling her, and she pulled round her the white velvet teacher's cape, which was probably the only thing that really did keep out the cold. On the stairs she passed Ragnhild's research room. Bent over her dishes, Cecilia could not help wondering how close the image of the witch, so focused on her work that she could work up to 30 hours at a time without a break, was to herself when she was so absorbed in her research. It was no wonder that Dobby would scold her, in his unique, subservient manner. "Oh, Dobby!" exclaimed Cecilia under her breath as she watched Ragnhild pick up a small vial out of which she drew with a syringe a small sample before adding it to another. "If only you could see me now." Ragnhild then shook the mixture before opening it and pouring it onto the gel plate. A DNA analysis. Genetic research, Cecilia knew. Her friend's research focused on the prevalence of wizard redheads, statistically disproportionate in all cultures and societies across the world, even in countries where this traditional Scandinavian coloring was unheard of. She had spoken to Cecilia about it. The fact that redheads were sensitive both emotionally and physically, burning at the mere forecast of a sunny day, intolerances and allergies, eczema and asthma, sensitive to bright lights and loud noises, being more than a touch irritating. All documented in non-wizard genetics work, and yet, as wizards, redheads had the ability in magical communities to be able to empathize with other wizards, making them excellent diplomats. At the moment, Cecilia knew, Ragnhild was on the long path of trying to establish exactly what gene was involved in empathic abilities. Cecilia turned away and began to make her way down the deep, narrow spiral staircase again, past Felixson's door, which was usually bolted shut. She paused, thinking about his contribution to wizard academia. The Art of the Wise, by Felixson, that was what the publication was called. Now it had been published in wizard bookshops, sitting next to the history books that his ancestors had written. They were history now. Mendel Felixson, his great-great-grandfather, author of The Myth of the Alder Magic and Its Use, Volume 3 Inches, and contemporary of Joseph Black. the champion of wizard-non-wizard collaboration and a supporter of black, would be turning in his grave. That he had once described Britain as a land with no magic was probably true. He was Norwegian, where the idea of magic had been unfettered by change for centuries, but it was hard to look at magic, as an outsider that Celia was, and separate all magic from it, so part of wizards' lives that it was in spells, rituals, convention, even the language used. How people could think that wizardry could be brought back to all magic when it was so different to their lives now was just fooling themselves. Besides, Cecilia thought as she continued downwards, the changes in wizards and non-wizards genetically over the centuries probably meant that the pursuit of all magic in its historical, in harmony with the earth and nature sense that conjurists purported to desire, meant that it was ultimately futile, which was probably why Joseph Black's idea of reciprocation between wizards and non-wizards had readily been accepted here. The murmur of students milling about below brought Cecilia out of her thoughts. In the entrance hall, which originally was on the ground but had been raised up from sea level with the school's ever-increasing library, small groups of students huddled together at the sight of her, whispering and giving her hopeful looks. So rare was the appearance of a teacher other than in their classroom a hubbub rouse. So different here to Hedgewood, Cecilia thought as she crossed the atrium and headed towards the corridor that led to the classrooms. Behind her, an expectant group of students began to follow her, 15, 20, following her in the hope that she would be teaching that afternoon. Cecilia remembered when she'd taught her first lesson at Hogwarts, 15-year-old Harry Potter in the class, then teaching him in the evenings about genetics, something that the young students were now following her for, demanding her time, so unlike the reluctant Harry. You could see why teachers stopped here, year after year, decade after decade, teaching students who not only wanted to be taught but demanded it. You felt proud of your work. You felt important. Even the craziest teacher at Durmstrang who believed that Napoleon was a myth and aliens darted around the universe in ships powered by Betty Bott's every flavor beans was listened to with reverence. And yet, even here some history was different. By pushing collaboration, Joseph Black had secured fortuitous gains for society at the end of the 18th century for Western civilization because it meant as industry and wealth grew helped by the use of magic rather than determined individuals linking things up together in other ways. Engineering, for example, had not been as big, for there was little need to cross Britain so quickly, so railways had to wait another 80 years before non-wizards wanted to travel across the country quickly like wizards could on their brooms, with flue powder or by disapparating. When the students were seated, Cecilia began her lesson, the next one along in sequence to mitochondrial action in her list of things to teach. As she launched into her discourse into the role of RNA in protein synthesis, Cecilia's work with Harry, the old Harry, in the other dimension, she recalled how she had incorporated parental love, namely Lily Potter's for her son as a physical thing, something which could be measured, recorded and observed in Harry, with a view to developing his potion. Even now, thinking about that at the back of her mind as the students before her scratched out the notes she had etched on the blackboard behind her, copied them furiously, it seemed so remote, like a story she had once read. Perhaps she had now, finally, got the old place out of her system, just as she had been on the brink of getting to the bottom of Harry's potion. 88,888,888. In another school, as dissimilar an academic institution as the former described, a first-year lesson about history was being given. Septimus tried to stifle a yawn and had to use all his effort to stop himself from falling asleep on a desk. He blinked, glancing at Julian, who was appearing to be wrapped in the topic that the ghost teacher Professor Binns was giving, but was in fact drawing the detail of the stained glass window that could be seen translucently through his body. It wasn't as if what the teacher was talking about wasn't interesting. His first lesson seemed to be quite interesting, about wizards who fought on the side of Henry V in return for his help against their persecution by the French. Wizard and non-wizard history together, as Uncle K had told him. But that had been Wednesday. It was now the following Monday and the professor had continued with the 100 Years' War, year by year, in agonizing detail. He'd only got to 1435 in this lesson, which meant that there was at least another week of it to go. Fixing his eyes on his parchment and realizing he had written precisely nothing that lesson, he took up his quill, trying to focus on what Professor Binns was saying. But it was hard to concentrate on a teacher when his voice was so monotonous, so instead he wrote down what he knew about the 100 Years' War. It lasted 100 years, Septimus wrote, before looking at his own untidy writing. That didn't seem right. These things didn't usually happen neatly, like 100 years. He crossed it out, before holding up his quill. And history of magic? History had had such a promising start. Professor Binns had talked animatedly, or as animatedly as a ghost could, about the history of Hedgewoods and how, as some of those people before him were from non-wizard heritage, it was a momentous time in the history of the school. Behind him, a huge book on a lectern had turned over a page by itself. A quill rose and had begun to write as the professor had spoken, recording what he had said. Septimus looked at the book now. Its early pages, near the bottom by the cover section on the right-hand side, looked brown and frail, and Septimus wondered if the book had actually sat there, day after day, year after year, recording events as they happened. Binns had mentioned old magic too, and had explained that it was the origin of modern spells and magic, words which had the right rhythm to work in prehistory, to live in harmony with nature and channel its gifts to make their lives more comfortable. "That's my research area," he'd declared, before beginning with his long speech beginning with the expulsion of all wizards and witches from France in 1366, who the French had blamed for the plague. "It's all very interesting," Septimus had said, on the evening of their first history lesson as they'd made their way towards the Quidditch pitch to watch the first of the friendlies, Hufflepuff versus Gryffindor. "But old magic, that's what the conjurists believe in," he'd added to Julian uncertainly as they'd pushed their way, with other students, in a general hubbub of excitement in what looked to be a close match, despite its status as a warm-up match. "But it's wrong, isn't it?" asked Julian, "to talk about conjurists? Won't Binns get into trouble for talking about old magic?" Septimus had shrugged. "It's the first year Hedgewoods teachers have to do research," Septimus replied, nudging Julian as Rufus Lestrange headed in their direction. "Uncle K said it was to strengthen international relations. Professor Snape's research is into diseases. Professor Longbottom's mad on plants " "He's great," nodded Julian. "I wish we'd had him in the summer. He could have told us what that yellow and red flower we found one old town was " "Yeah," Septimus had nodded in agreement, thinking about their herbology, plant biology professor who had started their first lesson by taking cuttings of deadly nightshades that they were going to graft with a plant which slowed down the heart rate, to see the effect of the second-generation plants on frogs. "But Durmstrang won't talk to Hedgewoods," he'd added, just as Julian had been about to ask Septimus why when a girl pushed her way between them and out of the main entrance doors. "Wasn't that Arella?" Septimus nodded. "Better keep out of the way, or else Or else what?" Behind them, as they turned quickly at the loud, mocking voice, Fraser Blewett stood over them. "Do you know why Arella was upset?" He turned accusingly to Julian. "Do you?" he asked, this time, of Septimus. Both of them shook their heads. "Well, something's upset her." To one side Septimus saw that Blewett was being followed by Darren Black and another boy with the rather unfortunate name of Wilbur Whimsy, who had been at his non-wizard primary school and had had to put up with the annoyance of being asked day after day to turn their teacher into a frog. It wasn't as, Septimus said, and not for the first time she felt rather sorry for the girl at having such a boy as her brother. But instead of stepping past them, as Septimus had thought that he would have, in order to find and comfort his sister, Blewett remained staring at them. And what's this about old magic? What? Asked Julian. You were talking about it. Tut tut, Blue-Wit added, shaking his head mockingly. I think your head of house should know that two of her students were talking about a banned subject. How can it be banned if Professor Binns had told us about it? Asked Carella, she was there. Septimus nudged him sharply, ignoring his friend's look of mild indignation. Careful, Septimus had added, talking in the dark look that had descended on the older boy's face. And what were you doing in Binns's class? Levitation? He began to stalk round them both, stating, at first, Septimus and then, Julian. No, but I can use technology, replied Julian boldly. See? A train? He angled his arm as if to lift up something that was heavy. Or a gun? As he was about to pull out of his pocket an imaginary gun. Immediately Fraser Blue-Wit had pulled out his wand. Leave her alone, Blue-Wit, Septimus had heard a voice say as he'd felt his body tense. It was never God when a wizard held his wand out in your direction, even if they were at school. It was Sam Potter. He then turned to Darren Black and Wilbur Whimsy. On your way to the match, lads? Slowly, with little enthusiasm, both boys nodded. Well, you can come with me, said Sam, waiting silently for Blue-Wit to lower his wand and, when once he'd done that in stony silence their head of house stepped between Harry and Julian, taking both boys around the shoulders momentarily. I'm the seeker tonight. Probably why we'll end up losing, but rules are rules, and I can't be a beater. Septimus had thought about the first match he'd seen at Hedgewood's, and his growing desire to be a part of the team. As Sam stepped by, Fraser Blue-Wit was just lowering his arm and Septimus noticed something on the older boy's arm. He realized that it was the same as the symbols that had been daubed, much to Cleus's annoyance, on the walls of Platform 8 and 3/8. Conjurists, Septimus knew. But why would anyone want the dangerous symbol of conjurism on his arm? And you're into sport as well, said Sam to Darren, who said nothing, but glowered silently. Behind him, however, a voice had called out. Oh, me too. Behind Wilbur Whimsy appeared, unmistakably, the curly hair giving it away somewhat. My mum's the Minister for Sport, he continued, pushing his way through between Darren and Wilbur, who pushed him back as he jostled them. I can't wait for the match. Victory, the present moment, Septimus thought, as Professor Binns continued with his discourse about King Henry VI, who was declared mad by his doctors because he claimed to be able to change objects into different ones, a trait of a person with a small amount of magic. And he was glad no one had chosen to make an issue of the word, freak, being yelled in their direction. Julian, who had been suffering from a bit of a cold, had simply grinned at Septimus, assuming that the word was meant for him. Now, looking across at his friend's work, he was delighted to see Julian had covered his page with medieval architecture that was the window frames surrounding the stained glass. He noticed the words, Joan of Arc, written on his book. Now that was interesting, and perhaps a little ironic. She had been on the side of those wishing to eliminate all wizards from France and was then accused of witchcraft herself, for which she had been burned at the stake. As the lesson drew to a close and the mass living coma that was all of the students in the room lifted, people stretched, read their work, puzzled over their notes, or rather a lack of them. 20 inches, or 200 words, he'd added, for those who wish to submit their work in non-wizard measurements, on the Lancastrian part of the 100 Years' War and how wizards and witches were involved in the official version of the story. Instead of checking his work, which he knew would be sparse in detail, Septimus put his hand in his pocket, a bolt of joy running through him as he felt Uncle K's letter that he'd received 5 days ago. Though he knew it word for word, Septimus opened it anyway and read through it. Sirius was awake, he read, skimming over his uncle's words. There's help for your father. Hope for his father. Hey, what are you grinning at? I saw you making notes. Julian looked down at Septimus's work. Not many, by the look of it. Well, there's some. We're not in art, Septimus replied, with equal jocularity. Ha! Julian looked back at his own work. And I misdrew a few bricks. I think that was when he started to walk about a bit. Julian folded his own attempt at notes into 4 and shoved it into his robe pocket. Not that it'll be any use for the homework. Come on, he added, looking at the door, we don't want to be round here when it's Quidditch tonight. Another friendly, Gryffindor, who had technically won their friendly against Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw. As they made their way down the corridor, Septimus's hand drifted to his pocket and he tapped it momentarily, wondering if his mum knew, or even if she'd got his letter to her yet. Septimus smiled as they rounded the corner which led to the staircase that led to the Gryffindor common room, hearing Julian sneeze and cough. A cold coming, probably, Julian commented, as he told him about how he thinks different rocks might be influenced by magic. As they got to the common room door, Julian dealt with the fat lady and, moments later, they were crossing the common room before climbing the stairs which led to the dorm so they could change. No matter how much he got on with his friend, he felt Julian's words taking a back seat as his mind was speculating on the news. Not that he could do much about it. But the simple fact that Cleus had bothered to tell him made Septimus delighted and filled him with hope. Sirius was awake. There was hope for his father.